So, Jake, let's talk about retrofitting sports lighting applications. So, outdoor baseball fields, football fields, soccer fields, and some of the challenges that come with those types of applications, specifically for retrofit, and then the solutions that Wisconsin Lighting Lab offers. In the last decade or so, there's been two schools of thought on how to approach these applications. You have onboard power and controls, or onboard drivers, and then you have remote power and controls.
Mm-hmm.
And the approach that we've taken is to offer both solutions, explain the trade-offs of each one, with the customer, and, really not try to push any one architecture, because that's all we offer, but, listen to them and, educate them so they can, make the best decision for their particular application. So let's start at the bottom of the pole, bottom of the light pole, and work our way up. If you're retrofitting a baseball field or a softball field, what's the first thing you think about as far as a remote power design architecture? What's the first thing you think about when approaching an application like that?
Yeah, sure. So there's the first thing I typically look at is around the base of the pole. I look to see if there's a panel that's existing there. If I see a panel there, now it's probably not because they have remote drivers or remote ballasts. It's probably actually because they have a disconnect down at the base of the pole. It was kind of common, especially with the HID stuff, to have a disconnect lower. Those disconnect panels are quite a bit smaller. There's usually like a lighting contactor and some type of a disconnect inside of those, essentially, is kind of what I look at, because that means that there's some type of hole already in the pole, and the electrical's coming from the inside of the pole to the outside of the pole, typically. Sometimes it can be coming from the outside, but most of the time it's coming from the inside. So that would be the first thing I would look at. And the reason why I would look at that is just because we might be able to reuse that hole. That might be a good starting point for us if we're using remote driver panels.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And as far as the contractor or the engineer on the project, when there is a remote power application, really what are they in charge of from a material standpoint versus what are we in charge of supplying? If it's remote power, we're supplying the remote power and control cabinets, we're supplying wiring harnesses, we're supplying a junction box at the top of the pole. From an electrical standpoint, where does the contractor's responsibility or the engineer's responsibility start and stop?
Yeah.
For a retrofit.
Yeah, for like a retrofit, assuming remote drivers, it would start at the service panel. You probably would want to take a look at that. Again, there's typically like a disconnect, maybe a contactor on the pole itself, but that's all being fed from somewhere. And whatever is the electrical room, wherever it's coming from, a panel just in the middle of a field. There's usually a disconnect at that place, at that location too. There's lighting contactors. First thing I would say is make sure that those contactors, a lot of the times they're very old. Make sure they're in good shape and they seem to be working. I have seen it where they will blow fuses, things like that in the field once new infrastructure gets put on. It's not necessarily meant for the big difference, like the HID lighting versus the LED lighting. It's kind of a significant change to the circuit and how it's been operating for the last, 20, 30 years. So that's like the first thing is what they would need to be aware of is just to make sure that type of equipment is kind of like up to date. I would say in quotes, because that equipment doesn't really get bad, but it can age and it can degrade. So that would be the first thing. Aside from that, adding surge protection, if it doesn't exist on those panels, is probably a good idea. That would be something that we always recommend, especially for LED installs. So that would be the first couple things.
And one of the positive benefits of remote power is inside of our panels we have fusing, we have surge protection. We have some of the power protection equipment that you don't typically have for an onboard driver application, where the drivers and the lighting equipment or the power equipment are up on top of the pole. So the contractor, the engineer, reviewing the panel, the contactors, making sure that everything's going to work okay when you start consuming half the power that you were with HID. But really, once you feed the pole with the right AC power, our system really takes over from there. And there's some mechanical things that need to happen with, drilling poles out and attaching the panels. But, if you have a lighting system that's 20, 30, 40 years old, you not only have to worry about the panels and the poles being fed, but you have old wiring and old harness running completely through the pole. So there are some major benefits to, being able to gut the pole essentially and have new electrical, because, the hope is that you don't have to replace the lights for another, 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And by that time, all the electrical running through the pole could be, many, many decades old. Yeah. So contractor engineer, make sure the power is good to the point of the pole. From there, we have fusing, we have surge protection, we have a harness. So that's really the positive benefit. So, what can you go into a little bit more detail in that scenario with Onboard? What would be some of the negative trade-offs from an electrical standpoint from your perspective?
Yeah, from my perspective, kind of starting with the things that you already highlighted, just like the existing wiring, the existing like conductors going up the pole. A lot of that stuff, I mean, it's been up for 15 to 30 years probably is a rough average. It's been swinging around. There's probably some strain release in there, but the wires still like swing around. They're hitting each other. There's sharp edges in the pole. Like you could have a lot of damage to just the insulation of the conductors. You see crazy things all the time with job sites. So anytime that you can like replace that, and it's a relatively low cost to replace that type of thing, is always positive.
And as far as replacing, when we're supplying remote power, it's already part of our system.
Yeah, and we're including it.
We're including it, and for larger applications, when there is remote power, there's controls. The cost differential between our onboard setup and a remote power setup is they're essentially a wash, because there's some economies of scale that kick in with the control system, and the fixture can be smaller if it's a remote power fixture. So that also helps with from some structural points of view. But as far as the electrical system, when you buy a remote power setup, not only are you getting new lights, new drivers, a new control system, you're getting brand new wiring running through the pole. So if the cost is essentially the same as Onboard, that is a huge benefit from a maintenance and a longevity standpoint. It doesn't mean that Onboard drivers aren't a good way to go in a lot of cases, but if cost is not a determining factor and you can upgrade your electrical system, you would want to highly consider doing that. So let's look at some of the negative trade-offs of remote power. Really, I think a lot of them revolve around the mounting and mechanical side of things. I know you're working on many, many jobs, right now, you're both on the design side and in the field. What are some of the things that contractors are concerned about when it comes to remote power and the mechanical side, and how can our team actually assist them through that process?
Yeah. So the big concerns would just be the first initial understanding that if you have an existing steel pole in the field and there's not any provisions in that pole, which a lot of times there isn't. Sometimes you might get lucky and you have a lower box like we talked about earlier, but you have to drill into that pole. It just is what it is. Some contractors are weary of that just for structural reasons. I've never run into an issue where I've seen a structural issue with that, but that doesn't obviously mean that it won't come up. It's going to come up depending on the age of the pole. We always tell customers to take a look and just take some at least understanding of what's going on with the current pole, how rusty it is, things like that.
And there are local options in many cases to connect with an engineering firm, and it's a very, very small percentage of the overall project to have a structural professional engineer come out and do a review. For larger projects, we do have access to engineering firms that are very familiar with these poles. They can do an inspection. They can check for loading and stress. That oftentimes doesn't happen. That is the owner and the end user's call. But know that you have local resources, and also we can help connect you with resources if you want to ensure that everything is structurally sound.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, where was I going with that?
Mounting. So knowing that
Okay.
through holes have to be drilled, and then also there's some field machining and then also mounting of the panels.
Yeah. So the way that our panel works is it's mounted via kind of like a bracket that uses straps, like banding, stainless steel bands. Occasionally, the existing poles are much larger than the standard bands go. So we just need to know at least some level of roughly what the diameter of the poles are, just to make sure we're providing the right amount of banding, like the right brackets, things like that. The straps we've never had an issue with. They're kind of finicky. They're kind of a pain in the butt sometimes to deal with, but there's not really a better way to do it on an existing pole. So that's what we use.
Not unless you want to weld, or not unless you want to have to machine and adjust the pole even more,
or drill into the pole again. And, So that's what we use. And contractors are used to using that type of banding. They use it to hold up conduit and stuff.
Traffic lights. There's other types. Some of the telecom infrastructure, antennas, things like that.
Yeah, and then the next thing after that, honestly, it gets easy after that, because the next thing you have to install, besides the lights at the top of the pole, is the wiring harness.
Yes.
And that's obviously very easy. We make it's all labeled. Every fixture is individually labeled so that it's quick connects. So that part is relatively easy. You just have to make sure it's strain release.
How is that typically done for retrofit? Is it? Yeah. I can't imagine they're trying to throw it up from the bottom.
I mean,
drop it from the top.
Yeah, there is probably a world where you could fish it from the bottom if you really needed to. I mean, there's probably someone out there that's done it, but generally it's done from the top down. So if you have to cut a hole at the top, or the hand hole, there's usually a hand hole at the top. You can cut a hole at the top for our top panel. Also, just the top cap comes off generally on these type of poles. Sometimes they're welded on if they're really old poles. I just ran into a job where that had happened.
What was welded on?
The top caps were.
Oh, really?
They tack welded them on.
Wow.
They weren't supposed to be, but they're very old poles, and I don't know if maybe one fell off at one point or something. Yeah. I'll probably mention that job again, because as we creep up to the top of the pole, there was another interesting thing that happened with this retrofit.
So electricians used to carry on field welders.
Yeah, apparently.
Interesting.
Or someone did.
Yeah.
They would drop it from the top down, I guess is the gist. Yeah.
Yep.
And then we cut them to length. They're the exact length as they need to be, with a little bit extra to spare, just in case the panels can't be mounted exactly where you want them to be. Just the last thing to mention too with retrofits that I just thought of was, on a lot of these older poles, the bulbs were changed by people climbing up them, and so we're running into a lot of poles with climbing structures on the back. The workaround for this right now is we're suggesting the panels to be mounted on the front of the pole, which honestly aesthetically it dresses it up a little bit, because that's the side that people are looking at.
Breaks
mostly.
up the pole structure a little bit.
It kind of looks a little bit nicer, but for the most part they're mounted on the back.
Yep.
I mean,
and we can also dress up the panels even beyond just
good point.
changing them. We can have we can paint the front covers. We can put logos and things on them. So. Sounds like that could be a good thing. Yeah,
for sure. So that's just another last thing to kind of keep in mind, is if there are climbing structures and they aren't necessarily removable and you can't really get around them, they would just have to go in the front.
Yep.
And it's never been an issue. So
okay. So at this point, the contractor or the engineer have double and triple checked the electrical system up until the point of the pole. We've field machined a few holes in the pole to mount or to run the wires, the harness through the incoming AC, and then our DC harness that goes to the top of the pole. And then we've used banding straps similar to traffic structures to mount the panels. We've dropped the harness for each panel from the top, and then have utilized a top hole to have the DC harness exit the pole. So what are some of the, if you're very, very honest, what are some of the pain points beyond some of the obvious things? So if there are, onboard seems easy. I don't think it's necessarily easy. There are other material trade-offs with onboard where you have to replicate control systems on every fixture versus having centralized control systems. But if we look specifically at the install and the contractor's ease of install, what are some of the negative trade-offs that we haven't touched on for remote?
Yeah, sure. So we've touched on this one already, but just getting past the drill. So just for, you said remote, but So just getting past the drilling of the poles first for the remote driver panels, that does seem to be a touching point that a lot of guys will be a little bit afraid of doing.
Yep.
So that's always going to come up. Guys will use like mag drills or something like that. We always recommend we can always work with the on-site people to make sure they got the right equipment, right size hole, and everything.
And I think that's another important thing to point out is, us as a smaller, medium-sized lighting company, a big portion of our value is support. Whereas I think people that are used to working with very, very large lighting companies, they don't necessarily get support once they start to install. Yeah. So, when we do a project like this, we're on the phone with the contractor daily. You and I are working on a project right now in Milwaukee for a large high school. We're going to be down there on site. So, the contractor knowing that they will have assistance along the way, I think maybe, eases some of that concern.
Yeah, for sure. And then the next thing is just going up the poles. Honestly, the existing brackets are the biggest issue. It's just figuring out a way to mount the lights to whatever is out there and making sure that whatever is out there is suitable for the fixtures, in good enough shape.
Yep.
The job that I was referencing earlier, they had cages at the top of the pole, which is very common with HID lighting. You climb up the pole. They had climbing structures, so the panels went on the front on this one too, like I just discussed. You climb up the pole, you stand in the cage, and you change all the bulbs. That's just what you did 30 years ago, whatever it was, 20 years ago.
Yep.
The problem with the cages is a lot of them are old and they're in relatively rough shape. So they're not usable now, and they're very heavy at the top of the pole. So this end user decided that they were going to take them all off, which in this case they had to saw them off.
So why do you think the poles are in good shape but the cages aren't?
The poles were not rusty at all. They looked like they were in great shape.
That's interesting.
Yeah, whatever the angle iron that they used to construct the baskets, the cages just looked pretty rough. Honestly, when they did take them down, and I was looking at them actually at the ground level, because it's always hard to tell up in the pole versus at the ground level, they didn't look bad. They could have reused them.
Yep.
But just to be safe, they were like, we're just going to take them off, put new cross arms on.
Yep.
So they used a cross arm with a U-bolt. They replaced all the baskets. So that was obviously added a ton of labor, because normally you're just trying to figure out how to put the light on what's existing.
Yep.
In this case, they spent half a day cutting off all the baskets. So that's just something to keep in mind. Is, I guess, like the bracket situation at the top of the pole isn't always just a perfect one-to-one fit, and kind of being flexible on site and thinking on your feet a little bit sometimes. Because we're talking about lights that are 60, 70, 80 feet in the air. It's not ever going to be a perfect match to what anyone can provide, unless we're climbing up the poles, unless we have a lot of good information up front, which is tough. It just is, because getting up to those fixtures just takes a lot of work, takes a lot of cost. So we understand why people can't get us all the information up front. So we try to do our best to provide a solution that can fit a variety of things.
And these are for applications where we did not do a pre-site visit.
Yeah,
we're
typically.
Essentially relying on the contractor or the owner to relay information. We do have applications where we'll do a pre-install, or even during the sales process, go and visit. We can take pictures. We can fly a drone. We can do some of the inspection. But you're talking in cases where really the first time they get up to the top of the pole might be when they install.
Yeah, exactly.
Which
and that's
does happen quite a bit.
Yeah, that's probably more common than not. So it does get tough, because a lot of times you're kind of thinking on the fly, which contractors are great at. And that's one thing that I will always say is a lot of all the contractors that we work with are great at thinking on their feet and figuring this out when they're in the field. A lot of times we're on the phone with them trying to figure it out with them. Just like going back to this one job I keep referencing, because it's a very unique job. The installer, they decided to cut the cages off. They actually, we never knew what the top diameter of those poles were, and we provided brackets to mount to the top of the poles. So we used a U-bolt design, which is great because it gives us a little bit of range to play with, because we weren't sure how big the poles were, and it's really hard to tell if they're not our poles. like what the existing diameters of the poles are. So in that case, we have like a U-bolt design that we can use that can kind of cover like a few inches range. We still have to get roughly close, but it at least gives us a little bit of play. And it ended up working out perfectly, which was good on that job because again, we didn't have a lot of information up front. So we were kind of guessing, and it worked out, which is good. So yeah, I just to kind of wrap that part up, like the brackets themselves can be tough. There's a lot of variety in brackets. There's angle iron brackets. There's the big baskets like we talked about. There's tubular brackets. I mean, there's literally anything you guys can. There's even bullhorns. Like sometimes you'll run into bullhorn brackets, like tube style brackets where you have to put like a tenon adapter on top. And just knowing the tenon adapter diameter, those can vary quite a bit. Like all those little things play a big role into making sure the job goes smoothly.
And what you just described there would be the case for onboard and remote.
Yeah, that doesn't matter no matter what.
This is the mechanical attachment of the fixtures themselves. Yeah. And with our fixture design, we have a pre-aiming system that corresponds to the lighting design, and that is a huge savings for the customer and for the contractor. Some of our large competitors, they have proprietary systems where you have to use their bracket, you have to use their full system, otherwise it doesn't work. Where with our system, we have the flexibility to use it on a variety of different mounts. Yep. And so that would be with pre-aiming. There are also a lot of companies that don't offer any pre-aiming. So the contractor has to set the up down. They have to set the left to right. So regardless of our system that we use, the fixtures come pre-aimed, which when compared to some of the other options in the market, that offsets a lot of the time and labor to drill a few holes in the pole.
Yeah. Also offsets a lot of phone calls because a lot of the times I think we do a great job of this, but there's just always things that come up in the field when contractors get fixtures in their hands. They want to ask questions, which I totally appreciate. It's just we do a pre-commissioning call where we go through the aiming diagram, everything like that, and we tell them now that we have this pre-aimed mount, and they're very excited about hearing that because they don't have to mess around with aiming the lights either at the top of the pole or at the base of the pole before they bring them up to the top of the pole. Just takes a lot of responsibility off of them, and contractors have a ton of responsibility. So it's like anything that we can like kind of soak up kind of helps them a lot. And I mean, we were talking about this, and it's like the worst parts to me at least are literally everything that you have to do no matter if you have a remote driver system or an onboard driver system. Like the mounting of the lights you have to do no matter what.
Yes.
So that's like, it's like the trade-off of having remote drivers versus not. There isn't much.
Yeah, I think there's just different. So for instance, the mounting of the fixtures, that's a wash, and we offer ways to make it easier. With the remote power, you save time and materials and get a higher quality system from an electrical standpoint, but there is a little bit more on the mechanical side. Yeah. With an onboard system, there's less mechanical stuff that you have to worry about, but you have a lot more to worry about on the electrical side. Yeah. So, if you look at if we start at the top of the pole, way the fixtures mount, basically that's the same. For an onboard setup, in many cases, the contractor has to source some type of a junction box or a power hub. Yep. We do have we do offer a suite of products where we can do that. So in some cases, the contractor wants to do it on their own. So they have to consolidate all the leads from all the fixtures into a power hub at the top. They have to inspect all the electrical running through the pole. They have to make sure that's adequate to support the new system. In a lot of cases, they have to source fast, fusing and things for the base of the pole. Whereas for remote power, as we talked, that a lot of that is taken care of. Yep. Trying to think of anything else, any other trade-offs for each system. This is just on install. Yep. Then you consider maintenance. So we have so few maintenance and warranty issues, almost zero when it comes to the LED chips themselves, the LED components. And in my mind, the things that you want in the hard to reach locations are the things that you don't want to have to maintain. And we don't really have any issues with LED chips. Right. The drivers protect LED trip. So if there's a power issue on site, which most problems with sports lighting systems are the result of power issues on site. If there is a power issue on site, the driver acts as a fuse and protects everything downstream of that, which in most cases are the LED chips themselves. So with a remote power application, the things you at the top of the pole are the things you have to worry about least. It's like set it and forget it. Yep. So in that case, with remote power, you're getting a new electrical system, you're getting new harnesses, the things that you are at the top of the pole in the hard to reach location, you don't have to worry about maintaining. And then the drivers are in easy to reach locations from a step ladder. You don't need to get a lift. If there are issues on site, you can get to them. Also, I think one of the biggest downsides with an onboard setup is when you have controls. And if you have 120 fixtures on a job site, there's 120 controllers that have to go on, basically one per fixture. Yep. So that's you go from having one control system to have to manage at the base of the pole to now you have sensitive electronics that are at the top of the pole again. So not only getting the drivers at the base of the pole, but getting the control systems, anything that might have to be serviced or maintained, the most susceptible stuff is in the easiest to reach location. So, all in all, when you look at material costs, labor costs, site electrical upgrades, remote versus onboard, maybe the remote is, slightly more expensive, all things considered, but you're offsetting so much from an electrical standpoint and from a maintenance standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah. And just like general things, again, just to keep in mind is as we're talking through the remote versus onboard, a lot of the times contractors, especially some of the better installs that I've seen that have onboard drivers, so drivers at the top, they will just go ahead and they'll source a panel that's going down below to put like a disconnect or fusing or something like that inside.
That's
of
a
it.
great point. So
they'll pull the wiring out. Yeah. They'll pull the old wiring out anyway. So it's like
that's a great point.
And contractors sometimes are disconnected from decisions that are made about this stuff. Where I might talk to a contractor and he'd be like, "Oh, I didn't even know you guys offered that. I would have asked the end user or whoever, the distributor, whoever, to throw that in with the system, so I didn't have to source it myself."
Yep.
So that's just another thing to keep in mind. Is like that's a very common thing that they do. They have to already, like you said before, there's a junction box at the top of the pole. Yep. They got to source that. Sometimes they're sourcing the wiring that's in the pole too, just to replace it. Like we talked about, there's a lot of old infrastructure that should be replaced. So
what you're saying are the jobs that are done right, the onboard jobs, they end up resembling a remote power system in a lot of ways, with the exception of having the drivers and the controllers at the base.
Exactly.
They still source a panel. They have, they have a way to protect those circuits at the bottom of the pole. They gut the pole of the existing electrical. They run new wiring. Mm-hmm. It's all the stuff that we're taking care of. And the other big benefit that I see, we're getting, several jobs like this a week, is, contractors are having a hard time sourcing things where we have inventory and we have stock of this stuff.
Yeah, true.
So when they go to install something, they don't have to run around locally and find the junction box or find the fusing or contact us and size things. We can take care of a lot of that at the factory. It just makes their life a lot easier. There are certain things we can't, certain things that have to be done locally. But we do try and support as much of that as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree.
Well, anything else? So Jake, if you were putting in a sports field, a baseball field, a softball field, what route would you go, and what would be some of the considerations?
The major considerations would be where it's located and what the power it's
retrofit specifically.
Retrofit, yeah. Like just what the power looks like. I would definitely put a Type 2 surge protector on whatever's feeding the electrical to the field. That's a must. It just seems like, for whatever reason, fields, especially like sports fields that are like older, They kind of just get like the bottom of the barrel power being fed to them from whatever they're being fed from.
Yep.
So that would be the first place I would go, and then I would go remote drivers 99.9% of the time.
Yep.
It just, everything just becomes so much easier. We obviously try our best to make sure that the fixtures are going to last. There's only so much we can do to prevent driver failure when there's electrical issues with the grid. There's obviously going to be acts of God like thunder strikes, or lightning strikes, things like that that are always out of everyone's control.
Yep.
And just being able to have direct access to the most important components, running the lights, is, I think, the most important thing.
Yep.
And I mean, that's you're keeping your field lit. We've done jobs where we've sent extra drivers just because we can. We know that even maybe the area is just more susceptible. Maybe it's down in Florida.
Yep.
More susceptible. We're just being realistic with the job site locations. We understand things happen, so we'll just throw in a few extra drivers just for the maintenance people to have on staff or on site.
Yep.
Just as like a freebie type of thing.
Well, very cool. I think we covered a lot of good stuff. So, yeah, we offer a lot of options for remote and onboard. We will not try and sell something just because we have limited options. We offer options for every type of application, and we will consider budget and consider support and consider everything before kind of finalizing a design architecture. But yeah, again, we can do both options. I think this outlines a lot of the trade-offs of each one.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of variables, and
Yes.
every single job is unique. So
Yep.
anything that we need to do to help make things smooth and go smoothly, we will try to do.
Cool, man.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Yep.